Hello, I'm here today to talk to you about this week's Sunday school lesson, which has everything to do with to tell you about Moses and how Moses was used by God to help free the Hebrew people from the land of Egypt. So look forward to the story. So let's look at what I'm looking at here. What you're seeing here is what I thought would be fun to maybe represent what people maybe looked like back in those days of the pharaohs and of Egypt and of Israel, so that you can see what maybe Moses possibly looked like. So let's all use our imaginations here as we begin to talk about the lesson today. So as we look here in the sandbox, I have a small representation of the story where it all began. And the Hebrew people lived in a land called Canaan. And in that land, there were trees and grass and water, and they had their sheep and farming and animals. And boy, they were living very, very, very well. But as time went on, something terrible happened. A big drought came. Now, if you know what a drought is when all the rain stops falling, the land goes dry, the water begins to go away, because there's no more rain. So the rivers dry up, and when the rivers dry up, the lakes dry up, and all of a sudden there's no water. Well, you probably know as well as I do, we all need water to survive. But not only humans and people like us, but sheep and goats and cows and dogs and cats, everybody needs water. So in the land of Canaan, the water was gone, the ground became very dry, the crops were dying, and the people were running out of food to eat. And the children were getting hungry. Everybody was wondering, God, what are we supposed to do? So what they decided to do, they heard about a land in a place called Egypt. And Egypt was very far away, which meant that all the people, the Hebrew people, were going to have to cross the desert. And we're going to talk about the desert here in just a second. So I'm going to remove the Canaan, the nice green grass, because that was gone. And here is the desert. The desert was a very, very dry place, all full of sand. There were no trees. There was very little water. Not a lot of plants or animals could survive because it was dry, but the Hebrew people had to cross that desert in order to get to Egypt. So that was a long and dangerous journey. So they took whatever animals they could that they still had, and they all began to march across the desert with everything they owned to get to the land of Egypt, because they wanted food and they needed water. So when they came to Egypt, they were all excited because Egypt had pyramids. It had big giant buildings of temples and streets and markets and farming, and it had the Nile River ran right by the city in Egypt where the Pharaoh lived. And they were all excited, I think, when they got there. But unfortunately, what happened when Pharaoh allowed all these people to come into Egypt, he thought, well, they're not like us, so we're going to make them slaves to help build more temples, to help build more pyramids, to help build our city. And okay, we'll feed them and we'll take care of them, but we're going to make them work and do whatever we tell them to do. So what happened is the Hebrew people became slaves. So even though they were able to get food and water, they lost all of their ability to really live the way they wanted to live. So they became enslaved to the Egyptian people and did all kinds of work for them. And they did that for a very, very, very long time. And as time went on, they began to get very upset about what was taking place. And they wanted God to help them. So they prayed and prayed and prayed. and cried out to God for help. So along came a man named Moses. Moses grew up in the land of Egypt. And actually, he grew up in the temple under Pharaoh's family. And God called him out. He was just an ordinary guy, a regular guy. But God wanted him to help rescue these people and save them from Egypt and bring them to the promised land. So what kind of happened here is Moses was chosen to do that. So Moses went to Pharaoh, who Pharaoh knew Moses very well. And he would say to Moses, he said to the Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Wow. Pharaoh thought, why would I let them go? These people are our slaves. They're building pyramids. They're building temples for free. All we have to do is feed them and give them water. And you know what? That's a pretty good deal. So you know what Moses said? What Pharaoh said to Moses? He said, "No, I will not let your people go." Wow. Moses went to God and said, "God, he just won't let these people go." So you know what God did? He sent 10 different plagues, 10 different things that would force the Egyptian people and the Pharaoh to really think carefully about letting these people go. And one of those was he turned all the water in Egypt into the color of blood. Scared everybody because the waters all around Egypt were red, just like blood. And everybody was crying out in Egypt, "Oh my, look at the water, it's turned into blood." Scared them all terribly. So Moses had, like I said, went to Pharaoh. "Let my people go." And Moses got the same reply once again. "No, I will not let your people go." So like I said, there were 10 different plagues. They even had one where everybody, their skin just itched and crawled and everybody was itching. They had this terrible time trying not to itch and scratch, and it was awful. They had gnats, they had bugs, they had locusts, and it was just, and every time Moses went to Pharaoh, he would say, "No, I will not let your people go." So Moses cried out to God over and over again. And finally, God sent the last plague that was the worst of all the plagues. This plague was, he sent his death angel to take the life of every single firstborn child of every single family throughout Egypt. That was the threat, and that happened. And during the night, the only people that knew what to do, Moses instructed the Hebrew people to take the blood of a lamb and to paint the outer edges of the doorposts to their homes, because if the angel was coming and the angel saw the blood of the lamb, he would pass over. He would not go into that home and take their child or their son or whomever he was coming for. But the Egyptian people didn't do that. So all throughout the city, firstborn children of every family died. Even Pharaoh himself, his son, died. And so Moses came to Pharaoh for this last time and said, "Pharaoh, let my people go." And you know what? Pharaoh almost started to put that hand up, but then all of a sudden, he realized he had no choice but to let the Hebrew people go with Moses. So he said, "You may go. You can take your possessions, but leave here right away. Get out of Egypt." So the people were excited, and they decided that it was time to go. So they gathered all their possessions, they marched out of that city and started to leave. And God had promised to send them to a promised land, a place where they would live and be happy and worship God forever. However, as they began to cross to get to this land, they came to the Red Sea. And when they got to the edge by the Red Sea, all of a sudden, though, in Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind. Have you ever changed your mind? When you were thinking you were going to do something and then you decided to do something else? Or maybe one of your parents said, well, we're going to go here, but now we're going to go there. You know, people change their minds. Well, when Pharaoh realized how much he lost by letting the Hebrew people go, all these slaves go, he changed his mind and decided to go after them to bring them back. So the Hebrew people got to the edge of this water, but they couldn't go through. It was too deep. And they could hear the chariots and the horses and the armies of Pharaoh coming in the distance for them. And they cried out to Moses, Moses, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of this? Did God bring us this far to let us die? Well, Moses knew that's not what God's intention was at all. So Moses took his staff and he held it out over the water. And you know what God did? God parted the Red Sea. So the water parted, just like it made a road. And the Hebrew people all marched through that Red Sea. And it said, even the ground that the water was in, the bottom of that lake was as dry ground. And they walked across the sea and got to the other side safely. And you know what happened? This is the exciting part, but not happy for Pharaoh and his army. The army was coming, and the people got to the other side. And they were so afraid because they thought Pharaoh's army was going to come across the same way. But Moses held out his staff once again over the water. And you know what God did? He closed the sea so that Pharaoh's army could not cross. In fact, Pharaoh's army had gotten into where the sea was, and the water closed in on them and killed the entire army that was chasing after the Hebrew people in the Red Sea. So that's a really big story. And you know what? The Hebrew people, from that point on, followed Moses onward. But what they did, which was really, really wonderful, is when they got to the other side, Miriam began to dance. Miriam was Moses' sister. And the people were so excited to see what God had done. She began to dance and dance and dance before God. And the people all rejoiced to realize how real God was to them and how God loved and cared for them enough to save them from Pharaoh's army, but also the promise to take them to a new land where they would live and enjoy life and worship God for many, many times to come. So that's the story about Moses, and there's a lot to it. So remember to go to your Bible and ask your mom or dad to help you find the story, but read that story because it's really very exciting. Now let me ask you, what parts of the story did you like? Did you like the part about coming to Egypt? If you've ever seen pictures of Egypt today, you still see the remains of pyramids, of temples, of beautiful structures along the water. I mean, Egypt was a beautiful place at one time, but it isn't like that today. It's a very different city from what we see from ancient times. Maybe you thought that Moses was a pretty cool guy with his staff. Can you imagine Moses working with God and God taking that staff and then allowing the water to separate so that people could be saved? That was pretty exciting. Can you imagine that? So think about the parts of the story that you like. Think about the parts of the story that mean something to you. Because you know what? The whole idea of this story is God cares about you. God is looking out for you. So let's all think about that this week when we think about Moses and the Hebrew people and what he did for them by saving them out of Egypt.